Hello, and thank you for joining us on this lovely Sunday afternoon on Memorial Day weekend. My name is Chrissy Hodges, and I am the host of Mental Illness Matters Radio. Now, I've been doing these little Google chats recently, and I think it's been so beneficial for people to hear these really important topics surrounding mental illness and substance use and stigma, to be able to see people's faces, to be able to hear and see who the people are. The audio, sometimes you get lost in not being able to see the person, so that's why I've really been loving the Google Chats and being able to have guests on and talk about what their experience with whatever topic we decide. So today we're going to be talking about addiction. Now, I've been advertising this week about what do you think about addiction? No, what do you really think about addiction? And the reason why I did that is because when I first started working as a peer specialist a little over a year and a half ago, I thought that I did not stigmatize people. And I quickly found out that I had my own stigmas against people, and the reason why is because I just hadn't been exposed to different worldview and different situations that people are in, and I'm going to say addiction was one of those pieces. I've had certain experiences in the last few years that have really opened my eyes to what addiction is and what addiction isn't. And so this has been a really eye-opening topic for me, and one that I feel very passionate about in my work and in my life, being able to dispel the stigma surrounding addiction. So that's a little bit about me. Today I have two guests on who are very passionate about this topic and have incredible knowledge when it comes to addiction and everything surrounding treatment and peer support and stigma. So we're going to get right into it. George, oh, and by the way, everybody here has a Southern accent, so this is so nice. And by the end of this, I'm going to be saying y'all and fixing to even more, which is exciting. So we'll start with George. George, if you could introduce yourself to us and tell us a little bit why this topic is so important to you.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you. I am a person in long-term recovery, and for me that means it's been, well, it'll be 26 years in another month since I last used alcohol and other drugs. And I talk about my recovery every opportunity I get, because I think everyone deserves to have similar opportunities to experience the benefits that come from stopping your use and developing a lifestyle of progressive health. For me, that's what really recovery is about. I am a licensed professional counselor and have over 70,000 hours of clinical experience, supervised experience. And in particular, what my passion today really is in working with people who are in recovery who are also providing certified peer support services. And that means on the substance use side, but also in terms of mental health, and also parents who are in care providing peer support. So that's a little bit about my background, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come on with Chris and Margaret and talk about this really important topic, because it's something that, as you pointed out in the beginning, we all are in a progressive form of becoming more aware of what our prejudices and biases are. And it's not a matter of having arrived. I do a fair amount of cultural competency training, and often people come in and say, well, you know, we did this, and so I'm culturally competent. And they kind of miss the point. And that is that for every individual on the planet, there's a story, and their definition of recovery and how they did it varies significantly. So I'll stop with that, and we can talk more about what that entails as far as our skills and abilities to work with others who are different from us.
Thank you, George. We're going to move right along to Margaret. Margaret, I'm hoping your video's working. We were trying to get Margaret on here with video for a little while, and that was not going well, but I think you were on and good to go. Margaret, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit why this topic is so important to you? Hello, Margaret. All
Her
right.
picture.
Yeah, Chrissy, it's.
Yay!
Can you see
Hello.
me?
Yes, there you are.
Yeah, my audio is not great, so you know, I'm gonna go with this and see what I can hear. So
It
it's off and
sounds good.
on.
It sounds good to us. You're clear as a bell.
Okay, okay. Well, I can't hear you all, kind of in and out, so might have to repeat a question.
Well, tell us, Margaret, who you are and why this topic is important to you.
My name is Margaret Sisson, and I am the executive director of Riley's Wish Foundation, which is named in the memory and honor of my son Riley Sisson, who I lost a year and a half ago to OCD and addiction. So I'm pretty compassionate and passionate about seeing what kind of changes we can make. At the International OCD Foundation, we are doing a mini track this year for the very first time on OCD and substance abuse disorders. So I'm excited about that and want to see some changes. So that's me in a nutshell.
So, Margaret, just if you have some earbuds, that might help with your audio. And I think we have a little bit of a delay too. Do you have some earphones or earbuds?
No.
Can you turn us up? Or I can just talk loud. I have no problem doing that.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And is it consistent? Because you're kind of in and out, so that's what I'm struggling with.
Well, I will. I'll try to talk a little bit louder, and I can actually. I'll text you too, like if that helps to clarify. So so moving right along, I think one of the biggest topics with addiction is going to be the stigma piece. So another thing that I wrote in the promo is that people may think, oh, well, addicts, they just need to stop, or they're just weak, or, oh, just put the bottle down, or go do something else. And I think for a long time, I actually adopted that view as well until I understood the disease of addiction. And it isn't just it isn't like a light switch you can just shut off at the end of the day or shut off when you're exposed to something that you're actually addicted to. So I definitely want to talk about the stigma, but I also want to talk about maybe some of the physical components that go along with addiction and why addiction becomes prevalent for someone. And George, I bet you are someone that can fill us in on that exact information.
I'll be glad to. So I guess the best place to start would be just kind of to define what this they refer to as addiction. The simplest definition I can give is that it is a continued use of alcohol or other drugs or other compulsive behaviors, even though you face repeated negative consequences. And so traditionally we've looked at it in terms of a distinction between physical dependency and mental dependency. Technically that went away with the last edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, but I think it's still in our cultural lexicon, and particularly that comes into play when we start talking about the differences between the addictive potential of specific substances. So the physical dependency typically is what people associate with a negative set of symptoms that occur when a person stops using. The most radical extreme, or the most extreme version of that, are the delirium tremens that occur when a person has used alcohol to the point that their body's homeostasis has adjusted to it, And when they stop using, they get sick. Now, for even non-dependent individuals, what we typically call that is a hangover. So if you drink enough to where your body becomes essentially toxic because of the alcohol that you put in it, when you stop, there's a period of time where the body has to readjust to alcohol not being there. So that's kind of the quintessential model that's applied to other drugs, most notably the opiates, as a really potentially life-threatening sequence of physical changes that occur as a result of stopping the alcohol and other drug use. And for a while, it was considered that certain drugs didn't cause that. For example, cocaine wasn't a problem in this country, wasn't clinically defined as a problem, literally until the 70s came along. Before that, cocaine was one of those drugs like marijuana that people said, oh, you don't become hooked on it, you don't become dependent on it, because people didn't experience the very visible signs that they had become dependent on the drug. But we now know that's an artificial distinction. And in addition to the nausea and the upset stomach and the headache, there are a host of psychological or mental conditions that go along with, that follow the high, that go along with the use. And those are just as significant as the physical problems that occur when the alcohol or the drug use is stopped. So the obsession, the decrease in libido or the drive to get up and do things, the ability to remember things and to keep priorities in order, all of that begins to slowly change over time. And for some drugs, it tends to happen quicker than with others. I'll also say that part of that sequence also seems to be sped up the earlier a person begins using alcohol and other drugs in their lives. So, for example, a 12 or a 13-year-old will often exhibit more severe physical deterioration and mental deterioration at a faster rate than somebody who does their first alcohol and other drugs at 20 or 22 years of age. So that's part of the sequence that clinically is examined to determine where a person is in that trajectory of going from a user to an abuser to somebody who is addicted.
So I think I can't see Margaret right now. I think she was trying to switch from iPad to computer. So while she's doing that, I do have a question actually to elaborate on that. George, one of the biggest questions that I get, I mean, and I have my own issues with substance use, which I don't talk a lot about, maybe because of stigma, maybe because I like to sometimes think that I have everything under control, but I do admittedly, I can be aware of when it's getting a little bit too bad and when to scale back. However, I also understand the difference between that and someone who has an addiction, and so I'm not classifying myself in the addiction category. And I mean that by saying, I'm not saying I understand fully, but that I have had some issues with it. I always hate it when people are like, well, you know, I have a little bit of an obsessive tendency, so I understand OCD, and I'm like, no, you don't. So I definitely, even though I understand what it means to have some issues with substance, I cannot understand what it means to be an addict and fully empathize with people that do. But here's the thing, I always get this question, George, and maybe you can help me clear this up, as well as probably people that are listening. People always ask, okay, are you predispositioned to have addiction, and how does that happen? Or are there some people that aren't predispositioned, but then they can develop addiction issues? What are your thoughts on that, or expertise on that?
Great question. And if I had the definitive answer, we could just stop and I could provide everybody with a cure. That's something that
I was hoping.
well, but that's been debated since Well, since science came along and before science, or is it environmental? And as a psychologist, my background and what I know from my experience is that it's not either or, it's both and. Unquestionably, there is an environmental impact. If your environment provides you with certain toys, chances are you're going to get pretty good at using those toys. If those toys aren't available in your environment, you're not going to develop the ability to have that as a skill or proficiency. On the other hand, we know due to genetics and more specifically epigenetics today that there is a generational component to the genes that are passed down that predispose people to certain types of behaviors or certain types of affinities for experience. Now, I don't think either one of those provides the absolute solution, but where that is important is in terms of how we align ourselves with specific pathways of recovery. So we generally can talk about 4 broad attitudes people have about alcohol or the drugs. And there's wide variation, and this has evolved over centuries of time, so this isn't necessarily anything that's new. The traditional, or the first approach perhaps that developed, was that alcohol and drug use is due to it's a moral deficiency. Something happens and the person's spirit or their soul gets contaminated, and so in order to take care of that problem, there are faith-based cures that are available. And then the second that came along said that, oh, it's a physical condition, it's a disease, and if that's the way you believe, then the most appropriate intervention is one prescribed by a doctor. We treat addictions, or we treat diseases. And so a medical model developed alongside with a faith-based model. And those two, there wasn't a whole lot of overlap. But we now know that there's other ways of doing it that do incorporate a collaboration among different pathways. So the third view is that, well, it really is an environmental issue. It's about what your mom and them did. You know, that group, your mom and them, throw in a good southern term there. So again, the environment and how you're raised, and in the clinical world today, there's a lot of talk about how we affiliate and the amount of nurture that we receive as we're growing up. And actually some relatively recent epigenetic research is starting to show that simple nurturing that occurs, not simple, but the nurturing that occurs early on in a person's life it looks like can reverse some of the genetic predispositions that we may have. Now that's all still pretty, it still has to be proven, but there's some suggested research that's coming out now that really is remarkable in that regard. And then so the fourth view is that, well, it's really, it's all of the above. And part of what we're about today, using a recovery-oriented system of care approach, is that regardless of whether we're talking about alcohol or drug use, mental conditions, physical conditions, it really is a matter of the individual figuring out what works for them and doing more of that. So if it's just a matter of going to church and finding Jesus, and many people have had those epiphanies and stopped using completely from that point forward. If that's what works for you, do it and keep doing it. Others want to go and talk to a doctor and maybe get some medications. And there's been a tradition in the addictions field that really has minimized that, or the stigma exists such that your recovery, if it's medicated assisted, is somehow secondary in terms of its quality to a person who is 100% abstinent. And then there's the social programs. And if we look at other cultures, or even in North America, the Native American cultures, most often the remedies that seem to be indigenous to a lot of cultures are social. So in the Native American culture, for example, going on wigwams and doing drum circles and going on spirit searches, those sorts of activities that are social in nature but that involve the person turning inward and tapping into the spirit that exists that flows through all of us, has been found to be a viable solution. So again, the point really is it's not which is the right answer, but it's what's the right answer for this individual at this point in time.
I like that, being able to see like the progression of being faith-based, and then we went to medical and now recovery, and being able to see that um, it can be any for anyone, or it can be a combination of all of them. There isn't necessarily one answer. So that's awesome. Thank you. So Margaret's with us, and I know she's having trouble hearing. So if you see me looking down, I'm typing stuff to her, so she'll be able to kind of understand where the conversation's going. So Margaret, I just texted her something I was going to ask. We talking about stigma and talking about whether or not, we're looking at people and we're saying, they're weak. Why can't you just put the bottle down? Why can't you just do this? Oh, you just must not care about your body, blah, 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 blah. You are a mother that watched her son deal with OCD and addiction together. What was it like for you to try to push this, push the thought of, okay, you can get better, but having your son, continually needing that relief from the addiction piece, but also not be able to fight the addiction, even though you and he both understood the consequences. What is that like as a mom and a parent?
And I got a little bit of what you said, but I think through the journey with Riley, it was a twofold, because we would treat OCD and then addiction would get better. It was a vicious cycle, and then we treat the addiction. And I've learned to use, or I like the term substance abuse disorder, because it is a disorder, and there, like we've been talking about, there is the stigma. And when I first got to the OCD conference, everybody talked about OCD, but no one talked about substance abuse disorder, and Riley so struggled with that. But that was, and even for me, I mean, I was embarrassed. I didn't want anybody to know that, because there is such a stigma to it. And so I watched as a journey, and I watched living with him and watching him, how he struggled and he hurt, and he hated the addiction. And as a parent, that's the one thing I feel like I always told him: I hate the addiction, always love you unconditionally, and to try to get you help, because it wasn't a choice. Oh no, it wasn't a choice. He hated it. So as a parent, it's a long journey to watch that, and my goal, and I guess my goal through Riley's Wish, will to be able to change that and to educate people, and those who are struggling like Riley, how do we help them? And we talk about, and George and Chrissy and I, all three, talk about this stigma, but I'd like to see, let's take it to the next. Now, what do we do? What do we do to help these people? And that will be my goal. I lost Riley, and because he so struggled with addiction, but no one understood that. So I say, as a parent, it's a journey that you have to support. You have to have the right resources to be able to do that. Have to have the right resources, and that's what we need to educate and let people know. Where are the resources? What do you do? How do you get, whether it get in somewhere or get therapy? And George, I'd love to hear your thoughts on with addiction, along with, to help someone with medication who's struggling with addiction, and not just anti-abuse, but I know there's medications, and I never even knew that was an option, those medications to decrease those cravings. So I'd love to talk about that too.
George, do you want to go ahead and address that? And while you do, I'm going to be typing to Margaret some of the stuff just in case you can't hear us, okay?
Okay. Well, I still appreciate the passion that's in your voice and your willingness to stand up and be the voice of one who has been on that journey with a loved one, because there are so many others who are struggling with that and who are on the other side of it, either in terms of people who have gotten into recovery or who weren't successful at doing that. And I think, before I move into answering the question about medication, I think the solutions have to involve us providing this type of forum and other forums that honor that voice and that develop what, as a community psychologist, I think the key is developing rituals and ceremonies that allow us to celebrate the successes as well as the challenges that come along this path, and do that in a way that begins to bring dignity and a sense of self-esteem back to the person as they reintegrate into a role that is valued not just by themselves, but also by the community. And for me, that's the piece that we spend a lot of time in this culture in particular, putting people away, telling them that you're bad and that you're not good, and then telling them this is what you have to do in order to get better. If we spent an equal amount of time on the back end of that process, celebrating, okay, you went to prison or you went to treatment and now you're back, and we appreciate you putting the time and the energy in to do that, and what's your next step, and celebrate that next step and the next step with as much conviction and vigor as we do on the front end of the process. It seems that would go a long way toward helping reintegrate and to use a non-clinical term, atone people so that they are restored back into the community. So on the medication side, we're kind of in the midst of a bit of a revolution now in this country, because the federal government has in earnest started pushing medicated-assisted treatment. The single most evidence-based drug treatment that exists on the planet, the one that's been researched the most, is methadone. Now, there are plenty of stories about people who started methadone who never got off, and how it began a treacherous spiral down that people never got out of. But I have heard just as many stories of people who said that taking methadone or naltrexone today, or buprenorphine for other conditions, gave them just enough space between that desire to use and actually using to where they were able to divert themselves and do something else. So whether we're talking about the use of naloxone for reversing overdoses, or longer-term narcotic antagonists like naltrexone and some of the other drugs. Those are viable options for people who decide that that's something they want to try. Maybe they've been through treatment and rehab several times, and they recognize that that desire to use is something that they needs that little something extra in order to get a better handle on putting into place a social support system that will allow them to come to that point in their lives where they realize, okay, maybe now I can try doing without this. But I can't say for any individual when they get to that point. I know for me, there was a point in my recovery where I said, it's time. I can't drink, I can't do the drugs that I was doing. And it wasn't an epiphany as such, but it came to me pretty strongly. And so for most of us, there is that. The ones of us who are lucky or the ones who are open to that experience, that tends to happen. So whether it's some sort of a short-term intervention that is medical-based, or for some people, they may in fact wind up taking medications for conditions that require longer periods of treatment. Again, it varies from individual to individual. But I think we're getting to the place, particularly in the substance use field, where we're starting to recognize that the white-knuckling, absolute 100% abstinence and 90 and 90 and continue going to meetings every day for the rest of your life approach just doesn't work for some folks.
Well, I'm gonna ask about the and I've texted this to Margaret, so she knows what I'm gonna ask about because she can't hear anything. It's sad. But so I'm going to go back to a piece that Margaret said, which is sorry, I have a little bit of an echo. Hating, what did I put? Hating the addiction. So one of the misconceptions in stigma is that people who are addicts are happy to do what they're doing, happy to partake in, I mean, whether it's alcohol abuse, drug abuse, sex addiction, things of that nature. I'm sure at the beginning most people you know, did see it as a means of escape, did see it as a means of getting away from what's going on before it became a full-blown addiction. And one of the things that I'm always trying to educate people on is people are not excited about what they're addicted to. I mean, it becomes a physical need, and it becomes, if the person can't get that, there's something off and it's unsatisfying. And I think that's one of the general misconceptions of the public and people who actually suffer or work and love people who have addictions. So Margaret, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to text you really quick what I'm talking about. Unless you can hear me, I'd like for you to comment about what it means to hate the addiction, but still not be able to stop with the addiction.
And Chrissy, I think you will really relate with the stigma of OCD. You know, people say, "Oh, I'm so OCD," and when they don't, and they think that it's a pleasurable, oh, I love to keep my house clean, or my things, as Riley would always say, you know, everything neat on my desk. The same thing. No, it's not pleasurable. Somebody with OCD who struggles with, you know, if they're, you know, somebody says, oh, I just love to have my house clean. Well, that's great. You like to have your house clean. Someone with OCD hates it and can't get out of the house because it's over and over and over and over. And it brings such anxiety. Well, same with addiction. You know, you're right. Maybe somebody starts as trying to self-medicate themselves, And then, but as time goes and someone struggles with substance abuse disorder, then no, because they destroy their family, and Riley always apologized all the things that he did when he was drinking, and he hated it. He hated what he did to his family, and he hated what he did to his friends, and he almost hurt people, and it was his biggest fear with his OCD because of addiction. So no, people don't. No, it's a disease, and is it hard to stop? Absolutely, yes. It's not like it was, oh, I decided I'm just going to quit. So that's where I think we can educate people and let them know that these people need help. And I always go back with the OCD. If they are struggling in residential and they slip because of addiction, well, then you treat them, because people are going to relapse. That's the nature of, unfortunately, addiction. And so, yes, I hate addiction. Loved my son. So how, if we can let people know and let them know that someone who struggles with addiction doesn't like how, you lose your family, your job, everything you loved because of addiction. Do you think they like that? No. So that's my
So on that note, Margaret, I'm going to direct a question to George. He had mentioned, and then to hear what Margaret was having to say, which is the same thing. George, you mentioned when you were ready to quit and be done, you made that decision. So this is also something that I have worked with people before, and I don't have the answer to. And this is, well, what do I do to convince someone it's time to quit? And I don't know the answer to that. There's always the speculation of, well, you have to have an intervention and people have to lose everything. So can you give us a little bit of insight from your own personal experience and maybe a little advice for us of what can we do, or is there anything that we can do to nudge someone forward to that point?
Yes, absolutely there is. And Margaret really touched on it when she was talking about how Riley really feared the idea that he would actually hurt people. And for me, 40 years ago when I got out of graduate school, I was going to go out there and I wanted to help people. I had my degree, and I was going to go do it by telling people how to fix themselves. And as a result of 40 years of experience and working with people who were better at helping others than I was, one of the things I learned is that I need to recognize my limitations and my strengths, and to build on what my strengths are with regards to developing effective relationships with other people. So that's kind of a long way of saying the key for me is a simple rule or guideline that I follow that basically says no fixing. The point isn't that what works is telling somebody what to do, but rather having a relationship with people that is of significant quality, that's mutually beneficial, so that the other person feels understood, heard, respected, and supported. And then there's some influence that comes from that relationship. But how people get to that point is quite varied. I've worked with people who wound up literally losing everything. I've worked with others who were nowhere near that point. I've worked with people who spent 30 years in prison and came out and went right back into a pattern of behavior that was self-destructive. So it's not so much about the consequences as it is having relationships with people where they feel heard, understood, and respected to the point at which they can begin to work through choices and options. And if I do this, this may happen. If I do that, this may happen. And for me, right here, right now, this is what I think my next step will be. And there's no magic bullet, and there's nothing that I wasn't born with a crystal ball, and I can't. When people come see me, I can't look in their eyes and say, "Well, I know where you are in this process," until I've heard their story and appreciate what they bring to the situation. And more often than not, it's my firm belief that people carry with them the skills and the resources that they need to address whatever's going on in their life at that point. Often they basically need some support in order to feel comfortable being uncomfortable. And that to me is kind of the secret. When you get to the place where I don't have to be 100% pain-free in order to appreciate the value that I have in life and in living, then there's some potential growth that can occur out of that. Yes, we have those periods where life is great and wonderful, but if there weren't peaks there and peaks and valleys, we wouldn't know how to appreciate the fact that things even out. So I don't have a short answer for that, but to me it is that connection. And through that connection, that's where the healing actually happens.
Well, I think that, just from even doing my work for a short period of time, a lot of it, there's so many other factors. So many other factors. It can't just be, I have an addiction. It has to do with whether or not they're, who your family is, what your support is, and whether or not your family is a support, what your monetary situation is, what part of the country you live in. There are so many factors that can determine what's going to stand in the way for someone to want to or seek help, or, it gets so complex. I agree, there's no one option, but I do think the power of this shared lived experience where someone says, hey, I can't imagine what it's like to be homeless. However, I do know what it's like to have an addiction or to go through this, and I can tell you it's possible. That's almost more powerful than any drug or therapy session that you could have. The power of peer support and people not feeling alone, I guess.
And let me say, I think you hit something really important there. It's not so much that I have had that lived experience myself, but if I have relationships with others who have. So I've never been homeless, but I know, 50, 80 people who have been homeless and who now are not. And carrying those stories with me and being able to share their experience and the hope that they carry is as powerful, I would say, as me being able to say, yeah, I was homeless. So I don't encourage anybody to go out and become homeless, just so you can help homeless people. But the idea is that it's the power of the story and the hope that comes out of the connection with people to be able to share that story of hope and strength and potentially talk about how people did it as options for the person that you're looking.
So I'm going to move on. Margaret, are you there?
Yes, can you see?
Yes. Yay! Okay, so I want to move on because I think this is a really important piece, and I know that this is something that we all want to talk about, which is the cultural competency piece. Margaret, I want to start with you, and I want to make sure that I have, that I'm on the right track, and if I'm not, y'all, like when it comes to cultural stuff, like like take it in the other direction. But I think one of the things we're facing in the United States, especially right now, is a huge like rash of addictions coming to light when it comes to painkillers and then heroin on the streets. And I think it's coming to our attention because it's entering, you know, neighborhoods where people wouldn't think that addiction exists. However, we all know it exists everywhere. It's just that all of a sudden it's starting to come up and, oh, we didn't know that this was possible in our neighborhood or my neighbors or my family. And so, Margaret, I wanted to start with you kind of on this piece, and then George, feel free to chime in. You know, with Riley, he, you know, oh my goodness, just, you know, star student, star football player, you know, the funniest guy in school. You know, no one would have ever known, especially the way that he hit it, that lurking in the shadows were all of the pain that he was suffering with when it came to OCD and addiction. And so I just wanted you to speak to that of, you know, what was it like becoming that family, becoming that, you know, coming to the realization of, oh, this doesn't just this is affecting us. Something that, and that's what to me breaks down all stigma. When you see, oh, this doesn't just affect the people on the street that are hanging around and don't have jobs and are holding up signs, it's affecting you. So if you could speak to that from your perspective and just like breaking down that the culture of, okay, this is actually happening to us. It's not just who we think are addicts.
Oh, I'll guarantee you that every family at some point has someone that has struggled with addiction. And yeah, like you said, you know, Riley was this bright, smart, incredible young man, and but struggled with addiction. And as I watched it get worse and worse, and not knowing, and I guess that will be my goal, is to help families who are in that, who have someone that's struggling, that it's okay to reach out. I never did. You know, I reached out to a doctor, but you know, you didn't talk about that. And then you didn't talk about OCD either until I got to the conference, and wow, I was talking about it. And Riley felt so safe, and had a support group, had peers that understood, who he could talk to. And like George is saying, you know, and both of you do such an incredible job with the peer support, and that is because at the end of the day, it's all about relationships, and addiction will isolate someone. It will isolate the person that is struggling with it, and it will isolate their family too. And I lived that. So for me to sit and talk about it, you know, Chrissy, I remember we did that radio show with Riley, and we talked about OCD, and we talked a little addiction, but not a lot, because Riley was afraid what people would think of him. And so you know, we lived that, and you know, we have young people dying everywhere, not just, you know, people. And I'll tell a little story. Somebody posted on Facebook of a beautiful young girl who passed away from a heroin overdose, and they posted, gosh, what a shame, you know, what a shame we're losing people to addiction. And so I messaged and to check to see if this was a family member, and they were like, no, but this girl didn't look like an addict. And I said, no, she didn't look like an addict, either did Riley, either did, you know. And we have this thought that it's the the homeless people, and and there's a good chance that homeless person who struggles now with addiction might have been a successful business person or had a family, had children, and that's why they're, Riley could have been homeless. He had just great support from family members. From his mom was his biggest cheer, and I was going to make sure trying to get him well. Not all families. It's hard to support somebody, and so everybody's touched by addiction. Everybody, and whether it's your family member or your boss or your coworkers. People struggle with addiction, and it's a disease that we need to make available for people to get help and for people to get better.
George, do you want to speak a little bit on the cultural competency part?
Well, of course, the irony for me, and I've been in this business for a while. People didn't just start dying from opiates. We've had whole communities that have been devastated just that they didn't look like you and me. They had a darker skin color. But suddenly, oh my gosh, we have this huge epidemic. Well, no, it's always been here. Just that the source now has changed. And a lot of what we're seeing with overdoses in particular, and other people get into opiate habits, is that they're getting them from the physicians instead of on the street. And which is kind of, it's a little paradoxical, because when we talk about medicated assisted recovery, we're suggesting people go to the people that started the habit to begin with in order to get the cure, which just is, I just, that's odd, to say the least. So no, this isn't a new phenomenon, and it's a little irritating that now suddenly it's being splashed all over the news and it's a hot item, when in fact, just like incarceration, we've promulgated this plague. I won't say intentionally, but we haven't done things to divert it when we could have in the past. So hooray for the efforts to get more people educated about what it takes. There are, in most states now, 911 amnesty laws, such that if you know of somebody who is overdosing, you can administer a naloxone, for example, and reverse that overdose. The saying here in Georgia from the Georgia Overdose Prevention folks is, don't run, call 911, because the law provides amnesty. So you can do the injection, and even if there's small quantities of drugs around, you won't get prosecuted by calling for medical assistance.
That's awesome.
Step forward. No, absolutely. And so my hat's off to the folks with the Georgia Overdose Prevention, because they really worked hard to get that bill passed in Georgia a couple of years ago. And they go around and do training to teach people how to administer the injections. And the last count I heard was that over 380 lives have specifically been saved since this law was passed in Georgia. So we're making some great strides, without a doubt.
I wish that we could bring that to Colorado. God, Georgia is so ahead of the game. We are so far behind.
There probably is a summer group in Colorado, but yeah, that's good work.
Well, it's been almost an hour, and it's time to wrap up. So I wanted to, I don't know, Margaret, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I just can't see you, Christy.
Oh, okay. Well, yay, you can hear, yay. But I wanted us to have an opportunity to just kind of say some final thoughts on wrapping up of, what you hope to see here soon in the future, or later in the future when it comes to addiction, and how we think about that. George, do you want to start?
Well, so I think the next step is to further develop platforms for recovery community organizations and for people in recovery voices to be heard, and for us to rally around supporting people who aren't yet even thinking about recovery, people who are in early recovery, and people who are in various stages after they've gotten into recovery, however they define that. And I think it does come down to doing some new rituals and some new ceremonies, and making that part of the institutional culture that's so missing today. And the last thing I want to say is happy birthday to Pastor Dr. Jay Hodges, in case he is listening.
Oh,
He's
yeah!
certainly one of my spiritual mentors who has had a significant impact on me, and I just wanted to thank him.
That's my dad!
Yeah, it is.
Now I feel guilty because I'm not the one that said it.
You can say it too.
Happy birthday, Daddy! Margaret, tell us some of your thoughts on where you'd like to see this go, and what we can do, and what's the future of breaking down these stigma walls with addiction.
Ditto with what George is saying. I certainly agree, and I think a lot of my goal even with Riley's Wish, I'd like to get into colleges, because there's a stigma of, a college student, he doesn't look like, or she doesn't look like an addict, but they're struggling. And I'd love to get in college programs. There are some good collegiate programs that are there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Need to offer for addiction and mental health, and a lot of times it's more for addiction, but I'd love to see mental health and help these young people. I guess that's always my passion, because Riley would have graduated this year from a master's program, and so I think that's what he'd like me to do. So those are my final words. Stay tuned.
There will be more final words from all of us, I'm sure. For me, I feel honored, and it's weird. I feel honored to be where I am today because I have such an empathetic demeanor about addiction. If it wasn't for my job and for just being able to open myself up to mental health advocacy, I would never have been able to break down my own stigma walls. And even though that's hard to do because it's scary to admit that you're wrong or you have been wrong about certain things, it has completely enriched my life to be able to, I work with people who have addiction issues every single day in my job, and they are some of the most beautiful, fascinating people that I've ever met. I feel so lucky to be able to be in people's lives and have an empathetic ear and not have to be blinded by stigma of what I believed or thought addiction was. So my goal, peer support, peer support, peer support. People who have issues with addiction, or people who are struggling and suffering with addiction or substance use issues, people who are family members, friends of people, and you watch and support people with addiction. Oh my gosh, get involved, become an advocate, join the movement, and let's change minds, and because it's going to take the stories of lived recovery and just lived experience on both sides of the coin to really start to make a difference and to break down this stigma. So those are my final words. I just want to thank you both, Margaret and George, for being on. I always love having y'all on the show and just being able to
Thank you, Chrissy.
It's such an honor for me to be in your lives and to watch what you do, and thank you for accepting me in your life.
Thank you.
So for all the listeners here for Mental Illness Matters Radio, I'm super excited. I'm revamping a little bit of a new show coming up this month. I have been doing a lot of, I'm going to interview and show people the different sides of or the different mental illness, addiction from personal stories, but I'm going to revamp some stuff starting in June. I am going to bring on different people that are going to co-host and we're going to have like mental health tip of the week and mental health fail of the week, which I'm the most excited about. I heard one on Sunday morning last week when one of the anchors said, "Oh my God, that's so OCD," and I almost threw my computer across the room. So I'll be rolling that out here in a couple weeks, but just want to let you know if you like what you hear here on the Google chat and on the audio for Mental Illness Matters Radio, please support the show. All it takes is $1 per show at www.patreon.com/the stigma of mental illness radio. This show is fully listener supported. So if you like what you hear, you want to hear more, and you want to be a person that's a change agent for mental health and substance abuse issues, please join forces so we can keep the show going. Again, I want to thank George and Margaret for joining me today, and thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, if you have any suggestions, if you want to be a host, if you want to be, or if you want to come on and say something fun, if you want to tell your story, please email me at ocd.chrissie@gmail.com. Thank you for tuning in today, and thank you for always listening to where we are changing the way people view mental illness and substance use. What is the proper term? Substance use
disorder.
Okay, I got it now. Substance use disorders, one personal story at a time.
Thank you, Chrissy.
Very nice.